Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Today, we're going to take a look at album follow-ups that we waited years for. Were they worth the wait? About 2 weeks ago on the channel, I took a look at some of the most disappointing metal albums of all time, which, got me thinking, what about more albums with tons of hype behind them, records that fans waited a super long time for? Well, here's 11 of those albums listed in order of, the gap between releases by each band. I'm going to go through each and debate whether or not they were worth the wait or they also disappointed. Let's get things started here with Thrack by King Crimson from 1995. This was the group's first full-length studio album in 11 years, following up 3 of A Perfect Pair, and their only full album featured the double trio lineup of Adrian Belew, Robert Fripp, Trey Gunn, Tony Levin, Bill Bruford, and Pat Mastelotto, and it's the final studio album of King Crimson to feature either Bill Bruford or Levin in the band, and, if there's one thing that King Crimson were great at doing throughout their entire careers, it's reinventing themselves, and this album is a total reinvention of the band's sound for the 90s here. Taking an industrial approach to this record is a bleak, raw-sounding album, and personally, this is one of my favorite eras of King Crimson. For a band who's had a ton of lineup changes and a ton of different eras and a ton of different sounds, this was an excellent comeback after 11 years since their last album, and one that I would say definitely lives up to the hype. 11 years after their last studio album, Psycho Circus, and several years after they should have retired in the first place, Kiss returned to the studio for Sonic Boom. The first album featured the modern Kiss lineup of Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Eric Singer, and Tommy Thayer. And the idea of this record was to prove that Kiss were still here and could still hang with the best of them in the studio, but in execution, this album is just generic paint-by-numbers Kiss, in my opinion. I know this album has its fans out there, but creatively it just did not have the same spark for me. And the record feels far too polished. Tommy Thayer is trying to play just like Ace Frehley. It's really a one-song record here, I would say, with Modern Day Delilah kicking things off. One of my, favorite Kiss songs from the 21st century, but, it's also one of my least favorite Kiss lineups here. And if anything, this album made it clear that they had nothing left to offer in the studio. It just feels very forced and definitely not worth the wait after over a decade for new music from a band who had basically confined themselves being a legacy nostalgia band by that point. How about Fear Inoculum by Tool? Tool made everyone wait 13 years due to creative, personal, and legal issues since their last album, 10,000 Days, in 2006, and we look to be in the process of the long waiting game yet again for another Tool record. I doubt we'll get any new Tool until 2027 at least, but at least we have this record here until then to hold us over Fear Inoculum from 2019, and this record feels very much like an extension of 10,000 Days in a lot of respects. Maynard's vocals are a little more laid back on this record. Was it worth the agonizing 13-year wait? I'd say absolutely. This is a more mature Tool here, and still as tight and precise, meticulous as ever. And these songs were proggy compositions with that mixing of progressiveness with psychedelia and a heavier element of alternative metal. Maynard is able to convey so much emotion in his vocals, and Danny Carey's drumming is phenomenal as always. Standouts here for me include Pneuma, the title track, Tempest, Culling Voices, Invincible, and more. And, I saw them on this tour a couple of years ago, and it was honestly one of the best shows I've ever seen. So Tool do not have a bad album. That's what makes, ranking the record so hard, and this certainly kept that streak alive. Following that up here, we have another album with a 13-year wait, that being The Next Day by David Bowie. This was Bowie's first album in 13 years after he'd retreated from the public eye due to health issues, and no one saw Bowie's return coming, and this album was recorded in secret, with Bowie once again working alongside longtime collaborator Tony Visconti. I think a lot of people assumed that Bowie was done by this point, but he made up for lost time in a big way here, and that was definitely worth the 13-year wait. New ideas and a fresh sound on The Next Day here, with standouts on here that I really enjoy, like the title track, The Stars Are Out Tonight, Valentine's Day, Where Are We Now, I'd Rather Be High, Dancing Out in Space, You Will Feel So Lonely You Could Die. Some great stuff on here, and Bowie returned with a more art rock approach as well, which is really cool. Another late stage career reinvention by the musical chameleon for sure, and an album that I think exists kind of in the shadow of Black Star now, knowing what we know and the fact that that was Bowie's last record, but still pretty underrated in his catalog and was met with acclaim upon its release. A Different Kind of Truth by Van Halen. This was VH's first full-length album of new studio material with lead singer David Lee Roth since 1984, and likewise, A Different Kind of Truth was Van Halen's first studio album since 1998's Van Halen 3, as well as their only studio album recorded without bassist Michael Anthony, who played bass on all the band's previous albums. Instead, he was replaced by Wolfgang Van Halen on this record, making it the only studio album with the band featuring Wolfgang, and, it would also be Eddie Van Halen's final record before his death in 2020, and this album is a return to form for the band, essentially checking off all the boxes of a Van Halen record. I really enjoy tracks on here like Tattoo, She's a Woman, and Blood and Fire, and it's not top shelf Van Halen in my opinion, but a fitting way to end their catalog, and you just couldn't end things on Van Halen 3, no way. So, after all this time, it's not an album on the level of the other David Lee Roth records, but I'm still glad we got it. I'll keep this next one brief because I just talked about it recently, my most disappointing albums video, but coming up next we have Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses. This was the band's first record since the Spaghetti Incident 15 years earlier, and their first of original material since Use Your Illusion 2 from 1991, and this whole thing presents like an Axl Rose solo project. It's all over the place with elements of hard rock, new metal, industrial, and more, and personally, I really like tracks on here, like the title track, Shackler's Revenge, Better, There Was a Time, Catcher in the Rye is great, right? This I Love. So there's some really good stuff on here. But after such a long wait and all the time, taken on this album, which included a revolving door of musicians, legal troubles, leaks, and more, it just couldn't live up to all that hype and left most fans feeling confused and let down. Not to mention it cost over $13 million to make, so probably not worth all that money either. Top 5 here, the gaps in between releases are getting longer and longer. Now 19 years for The Zealot Gene by Jethro Tull. Nearly 5 years in production. It's their first studio album since the Jethro Tull Christmas album in 2003, but their first of all new original material since JethroTull.com in 1999, make it the longest gap in between the band's studio albums. Also their first album since 1968's This Was, to be made without guitarist Martin Barre. And while Ian Anderson's vocals have seen better days, of course, and Martin Barre's presence is definitely, his absence, I should say, is definitely felt on this record, the classic Tull elements are still there, and they're still operating at a high level of musicianship, leaning into darker, more reflective themes, that reflect on the band's current stage. The flute work is still front and center, and the arrangements are tight, more stripped back than their 70s epics, but, still full of character, and it's not trying to be aqualung or thick as a brick, and that's a good thing. Instead it shows the band aging with purpose, still pushing their own ideas and doing so on their own terms. 20 years in between studio albums for Pink Floyd, finally following up the Division Bell with 2014's The Endless River, and the band once again led by David Gilmour, and it's the first of theirs to be released after the death of keyboardist Richard Wright, who appears posthumously on this record, serves as a tribute to him in a lot of ways, but it's made up mainly of instrumental and ambient music from leftovers from the Division Bell sessions, and, Pink Floyd have always been amazing at conjuring up trippy, otherworldly atmospheres, but I think the lack of vocals hurts this album as a lot of the tracks blend together. And if you look at it like a tribute to Richard Wright, the band kind of emptying their vaults here from the Division Bell sessions, it's a fine album in that case. Good sleeping or thinking music, I guess. But as a proper Pink Floyd record, a pretty bland way to end their catalog after a 20-year gap. Top 3 here, we have I.O. by Peter Gabriel, his first album of new material since 2002's Up. I.O. was worth the wait because it felt like the natural evolution of Peter Gabriel's work. Thoughtful, sonically detailed, and really an emotionally grounded record as well. It builds on the strengths of his past albums without repeating them, blending intricate production with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from experience, and, songs are layered and nuanced. The dual mixes highlight how much care went into shaping the sound of this record, and Gabriel's voice has, aged in a way that adds to the weight and honesty of the new material here, and the whole album feels lived in, like something that had to take time to get right? I mean, he had 21 years, but it's just not flashy, but also deeply considered, and that's what makes it great, in my opinion. Number 2, the reunion album by the Stooges, The Weirdness After 34 Years. Released on March 5th, 2007, it's the first Stooges album of new material since Raw Power from 1973. Also, the final album feature guitarist Ron Asheton, who passed in early 2009. And for me, The Weirdness is a disappointing record because it doesn't feel like the Stooges at their best at all. It feels like a reunion album that never quite figures out what it wants to be. There's a rawness there for sure, but it's missing the danger and urgency that made their early work so electric. I feel like the production is too clean, clean, and the songwriting feels half-baked. Compared to his past work, I think Iggy's lyrics, border on parody than anything else here, and I think it's great that the band, got back together, and their flesh is what made them so influential on this record, but overall it comes off as more of a missed opportunity than a triumphant return, and certainly does not live up to their past work. And last but not least here, the longest gap on this list, 51 years for The Revenge of Alice Cooper. It had been over 50 years since the original Alice Cooper band made a new record, but finally this year the prayers of longtime Cooper fans were answered when Alice, Michael Bruce, Dennis Dunaway, and Neil Smith reunited in the studio with old recordings from late guitarist Glenn Buxton to work on the follow-up to Muscle of Love from 1973, and personally, I really like this album. I do. It's a lot of fun, and at the end of the day, that's what the original band was all about. Having fun, not taking things too seriously. In terms of capturing the magic of the original band, I'd say it's 50-50. 50% sounds like an Alice solo record, 50% sounds like an original band, record here, so it does have some great moments, some standout tracks on here that I enjoy, like Black Mamba. Wild's one, I think, is a great tribute to the Detroit rock sound. Kill the Flies is a lot of fun. Blood on the Sun is great. Got some really cool lyrics on that. See You on the Other Side is fantastic. Great ballad. What a Sid. So there's some good stuff on here for sure, that show the magic is still there. So even if the album is not on the level of Killer or Billion Dollar Babies, I still think it's a really cool record. Very laid back. Kind of feels like a jam session between old friends. And I would say worth the wait. However, for those who waited the full 51 years for it, they may have expected a little bit more. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at some long-awaited album follow-ups and determining were they worth the wait. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on my choices? Do you think they lived up to the hype? What are some other albums you waited a long time for and found that they were or weren't worth the wait? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.